amazing people who are going to lead it for us. And one of them is Ivan. And with Ivan, we have an amazing young man, a scholar in African art history. And I'm going to let him introduce himself because I can never do him justice with the resume that he has. Max Delanium Jefferson.
Hi, Max. Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
All right. It is a pleasure to be here. I guess I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Max Diallo Jacobson. I am a Swedish Ghanaian art historian and curator. What does that mean? That means I have studied and specialized in the history of art coming out of Africa and created by African artists. I then work with galleries, museums, and other types of platforms to bring that work to the world. And because one of my specialties within art history is textiles, that has also allowed me to work a lot with fashion designers, and so I've worked in New York Fashion Week, Paris Fashion Week with various designers to present there. And I'm excited to have this conversation and to get to know all of you guys and answer your questions.
Yeah, so I think this is going to be an interesting conversation for myself as well. I think the work that you do is really deep. When I read your biography, I was quite touched by how many different spaces you were covering. So we'll try and get into that and try and give the people a bit more depth into you and see if we can answer some of their questions as well. So just starting off, I think one of the questions that at least I have nowadays, especially with how the world is changing with a lot of technology and a lot of different initiatives happening and different spaces being made available and unavailable to our culture. What do you think is what do you think is the easiest way to kind of navigate between where to place your sense of communication? So a lot of people communicate in social media, and that's like a really big thing. But is that the best? You don't maybe communicate as much physically in person and have conversations, and maybe debates that happen that are like viral, and people take a lot from that. But I think those conversations that happen in the physical space are a lot more often safe, and people take more from it. So what are your thoughts on those types of conversation and communication in digital versus physical spaces?
Thank you so much for that question. I think we often separate between the digital and the physical as if they are realms that don't interact and that are fundamentally work in different ways. But the truth is, I think, what we can think more about is how these two realms can conspire together to actually enact change. One of the conversation points that has emerged from this talk today is about how, what we can do as people based in Sweden or Stockholm about issues that are occurring elsewhere, about communities that matter to us in a different context. And the digital, world allows us to bridge that gap in really important ways, educational ways, reach, making things accessible. But what I also notice is that it allows us to be complacent, thinking that what we do on the digital landscape is enough. And so in my specialty, which is art, there is nothing better than what we can experience in the physical world. I mean, it's the same thing about listening to a song in your headphones versus going to a concert. It's going to seeing an artwork on Instagram versus seeing it in a physical space. You see these beautiful prints and paintings up on these walls would look very different if you just engage with them on your phone. And so I think we need to, and this is quite obvious, think about how we can activate the digital space to bring people into physical spaces like we're doing today. you know, in many ways, the fact that I am here was because you found me digitally, and now I'm physically here. And so I think that is an example of how we can make the bridge between those two worlds happen better.
Yeah, I think that's, I agree 100%. I think an interesting kind of segue with that question of physical versus digital, and also understanding that the life that a lot of people live and where they put their focus and their time is digitally nowadays, especially with the younger generation. We still find ourselves with the need to preserve, to teach, to conserve our culture. How do we do that nowadays where so many people are alive digitally but aren't so open to things like this? How do we kind of bridge that gap, especially with the younger generation, where physically we might have been able to, you know, have house parties or gatherings at our parents' or cousins' place and, you know, teach and like have traditionally passed down in that way. We maybe aren't able to do that as much nowadays. Do you see any space there to kind of find a way through that?
I think if you begin with so you keep it constant and you understand that we are in a violently global society where, I mean, if you look at the conversation that we're having today, we're having a conversation in Stockholm about Africa in English, you know, and where I speak with a horrible American accent, even though I'm not American, you know. We think about the ways in which we are raised now in an intensely global society, and we're going to have to compete on that global level. And so when I think about African art and culture, I think about it as something that we now need to understand as existing in the global arena, and it being compared and contrasted and, like I said, competing in those spaces. And that, I think, allows us to then think more deeply about how we can innovate to be at that stage. When we think about music, I bring it up again, even though it's not my specialty, we're experiencing African music being played all around the world. Why is that happening? Because they had to sort of bridge that gap and bring and merge some of our intensely fantastic skills that we have had on the continent for decades. You know, bring that into the global stage, present that to the world, and show, look what we've been doing this entire time. It's fantastic, and now you get to experience it. And I think the same thing with, and that is how I see the younger generation and how you bring them in. I think by trying to tell the younger generation constantly about, look at these great things we had in the past. You should be interested about these old things that are really old and beautiful. I'm not sure that always is going to work. It worked on me, I'm an art historian, but it's not going to work on our younger kids. And so we need to think about how we bring those beautiful old traditions, bring them to the present, maybe innovate a little bit on them, and make them quote unquote cool again for the young generation.
Yeah. Be careful. Thank you. So, kind of on that subject as well, I think events like this have been put on, thankfully, through the help of Stockholm Start, and I think it's a work that goes on, and a lot of people have to put in a lot of effort to make something like this happen. I'm really thankful and grateful for that. But of course, we do see there is a need for the processes to be maybe a bit simpler to make something like this happen, because I think everyone can agree that this is needed more. So there's a responsibility that lies somewhere. And there are government associations, there are cultural organizations. How do we tell them that this is something that needs to happen more and needs to happen in a way that isn't, it needs to be made easier. So how do we communicate that need?
That's a really great question, and I think in order to answer that question, I actually have to step out from sort of the conversation about Sweden in particular, because for context, I do not live in Sweden. I am originally from Sweden on my dad's side. I lived here until 2017, and then my family left. We went to France, and then the entire family, after 2 years in France, returned to Africa. And ever since, they've been living in Senegal. And I myself have been based mostly in Guinea, which is where my mom is from. And I think a place like Dakar, if anyone here has had the opportunity to be there, is a fantastic, beautiful city that has a lot of energy, especially when it comes to culture. Lots of events constantly, lots of galleries, festivals, concerts. Many of them are funded by diplomatic bodies that live in Dakar. So the French embassy, the Italian embassy, the German, the EU. It means that when you're in Dakar and you're experiencing the beauty of that city, how enlivened African culture feels there, you're also seeing at the bottom all the sponsors of those events, and you realize that that support comes with requirements. It always comes with strings attached, and it also is not sustainable. You know, because one day the French embassy can choose, oh, well, we're not that interested in funding your little festival anymore. We're going to pull out that funding. And suddenly, it's something that you have been working on in this country, in Dakar in that case, in Senegal, falls through and disappears. That has taught me, and I think teaches all of us, that relying on sponsorships from government bodies is never sustainable. I believe that they have a duty to fund a lot of these initiatives, because if you think about these Western countries and the wealth they've accumulated and that they have today, so much of that wealth was built off of exploiting our geographies and our people. So yes, they have a duty, but that duty, I don't know how long that is going to last, that feeling of indebtedness, like them feeling indebted or feeling like they owe us this money. That's not going to last. And so thinking about places like this, the work that I do in culture, I'm always thinking about, well, we need to build our own companies, we need to build our own institutions that themselves can sustain, and they can get, that extra help along the way to jumpstart, to expand, but we need to have our own sustainable sort of paths forward. And how do we do that? There are many ways. You can think about it as being a commercial venture. If it is a commercial venture, how does that allow it to then sustain itself? You can think about it being funded by our own people. How does that happen? With a lot of the work that I do physically on the African continent, which is where I'm based full-time, one of the big things we're facing is, well, how do we get all these wealthy Africans who have so much money to stop sending their money to Switzerland and instead investing their money back into their own countries? So there's small things like that we're, I think, challenges that we're not, to be honest, facing head-on as much as we should, because we are allowed to kind of rely on these interim funding bodies, but that are going to be an issue in the long term, because that's not sustainable. So I can't answer specifically for Stockholm and Sweden, but I think there may be some similarities.
Yeah, I definitely think there's some translatable concepts there, so I think that's really good. I think I want to focus a bit more on you and your journey. You mentioned about spending time in France and now being based in Guinea, and specifically your academic background when it comes to history. How do you feel like that has informed your intentions in your work now? Because I think a lot of people can, for example, go to museums like the Ethnological Museum here and take part in history, but it's kind of, okay, that's how it was, and that's it, oh, this is really brilliant, that's it. How do we take more from that in the music for intentions and initiatives now?
Thank you so much for that question. I'm very happy to share a little bit about myself, and if you have any questions at the end, I'm happy to answer them. So my sort of weird, convoluted story is that grew up a little bit here in Sweden, went back and forth to Guinea and Senegal when I was younger with my family, did high school in France, and then I ended up moving to America for college. And I went to a small school named Princeton, and I arrived at that school and I was astounded by how many Africans there were there. You know, that's not often an understanding we have of these, you know, famous elite institutions. I thought that I would be going there and I would have to like, you know, eat very sad food for 4 years and not have a, you know, fun, lively time. And then I arrived there and, you know, we had a really strong, bold, united African community at that university. However, and this is not necessarily a negative, but this is something I experienced, all the Africans that I met, we were studying engineering, pre-med, or finance. There was not a single African who was invested in arts or culture. That's not because they don't engage or want to, it's because of financial reasons. You know, you have worked really hard to get into a good school and you have family pressure to sustain and support your own family. You're going to take a path that is very stable to a good career. What that meant is, you know, I've always been interested in history and art, and I arrived there. I began taking courses in the history department at Princeton and the art history department. They have a really strong sort of reputation for their work on African history. But of course, there's not a single African professor who teaches African history at Princeton. And also, there was no other African or even Black student in those entire departments. So I was the only one the entire time. There was one professor, and if there's anyone you need to look up on, of course all these incredible speakers, but if there's someone else you need to look up when you go home tonight, his name is Chika Okeke Agulu. He's a Nigerian art historian based at that university. And he literally changed my entire life when I saw him. Because here was this man who had studied at the University of Ibadan and at the University of Nsukka in Nigeria, worked his way up, becoming a professor in art history, focusing on Nigerian art. He's now teaching at Princeton, and he told me this one simple thing when I met him, which is that Africa is not lacking in terms of talent and culture. You know, when it comes to his specialty, which is art, Nigeria is full of talented painters, sculptors, artisans. What they are lacking, however, are people who are able to defend, explain, and promote that culture. You know, when it comes to art history, you can look at a fantastic painting and everyone can have their own opinions about it. But sometimes it helps if there's someone who knows a little bit about art who can say, this is really good and this is why, and give you reasons for it. And he argued, Chika, that is one of the many things that we're missing in Africa today, and that is what he devoted his entire life to. Because if we do not write or explain or research or document our own histories, our own art, other people will do it for you, and they'll profit off of it, and they'll take whatever is most precious from it and adapt it into their own work. And so that is what completely derailed my plan, was being him. And ever since, I've been in positions where we are experiencing, especially in this day and age, a shift where 20, 30 years ago, a lot of the conversation when it came to African art, African culture, was that, oh, well, there aren't any experts to talk about this. Or when it came to repatriation of artifacts, it was, oh, well, there are no museums in Africa we can send the works back to, was what they would say here in Europe. That argument in the next 5 to 10 years, or already in the last 5 to 10 years, is falling apart. Because we now have and have had, or the experts are now getting recognition for the incredible scholarship that they've been doing. And we have a new generation of scholars emerging where those arguments are not going to work anymore. And that art is going to have to return to Africa. Conversations about African art is going to have, these conversations are going to be had by experts about African art. And so I'm excited to see that changing. And that's what I contribute to.
Amazing. I think, again, as I said when I read your bio, I think it's super important work that you do, so thank you for that. I think you mentioned something important, which we see unfortunately quite often, which is people, for better or for worse, taking and representing African culture in the way that they see it. How can we talk to our native Swedes, maybe, native Europeans, about that type of representation and what is important to think about? There's words that I think of when talking about this, like gatekeeping and cultural appropriation, and I think a lot of that kind of stuff can be stigmatized when I think it's more about creating an understanding. I think a lot of the time intentions can be quite good, but things done in the wrong way without the right knowledge can come out on the other side not looking so good. So how do we actually teach and give that information so that people actually do end up in the right space at the end of it?
I think when it comes to that example of constantly having to educate or correct other people, my personal stance on this, which may not be the most popular stance, is that it is not my job to constantly educate you to try to fix your ways. Because I think that is a vicious and insidious game that has been made that actually wastes our own energy and time. For decades, this is not a new conversation, for decades, African peoples, African scholars, writers, thinkers have been outlining how we should, the words we should use when talking about our people, the ways we should address one another with respect. And those books are out there. Those articles, those videos, like this discourse has occurred. And so I cannot waste my time constantly repeating that to the masses. I'd rather focus on my own work, my own innovation. And you're going to have to adapt your language to what I'm doing. And I think, to be very honest, in certain spaces we're seeing that happen. In the spaces that I specifically work in, which I understand is not the global, the mass population, but within the art world, within the fashion spaces, African creatives have put their foot down and said, this is how you address my work, this is the language around my work, and this is how you should pursue it. If you don't want to adapt to my language, that's your problem, and then you're going to fall behind. And so my stance is, it's not my job to keep educating these people. I'm just going to focus on perfecting my own work.
Totally understandable, and I think it's great to be honest with that stuff. Messi, did you want to say? Oh, we can speak. So we can just speak a bit closer to the microphone, then I think we'll be good. Cool, great. Yeah, no, I think it's a really good point. I think something I've struggled with personally is since I moved here, I've been living in Stockholm or Sweden 10 years. One thing I struggled with is making sure, or feeling the need to make sure that my culture is accessible. And me coming from London, born and raised, but having parents from Uganda, I have a couple of different cultures. And yeah, it's kind of like an ongoing struggle to understand, okay, well, I mean, these people seem nice, they want to partake. How do I navigate that space? And kind of fall between two sides. And I think that's like allowing for that is good. And that's kind of why I wanted to ask the question, because I think it's great to hear from someone like you, your opinion and what is the best way to do it. So thank you for sharing that. I think we're going to go for another couple of minutes. And maybe we can actually pass it on to the audience if anyone has any questions in the audience for Max. And we can speak in a couple of minutes. Yes? Welcome to you.
You can just be close to me.
Hi, can you hear me now? I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what themes you're what interests you, what you like to watch at the moment?
Thank you so much for that question. I realized I actually didn't give a lot of specific examples of the work that I do, so thank you for giving me that opportunity. So like I said, I'm an arts curator. That means that it can mean a lot of things, but it means that I'm the one usually leading a curatorial project on an exhibition. If it's about selecting works that are presented, I or my team are the ones choosing who is invited to show their work. Or if I'm working with a collection of works, I'm the one pointing out this is what I want to show and why. And importantly, I'm also then the person who bridges and explains why that selection was made. And so that comes with a lot of responsibility, which is why it is work that is usually done by researchers, because you are expected to take the time to really become an expert on the thing you are then presenting about. It would be unfathomable for me to do an exhibition about a subject that I have not spent years studying to make sure that I do this correctly. And one of the themes that I've been pursuing for the last few years is the theme of materiality, which many art historians and artists are making an argument for is a pattern that has been taken, or a movement in the art world that has been taken away from Africans, when in reality it's something that is deeply embedded in the African artistic tradition. So what is materiality? It is artists who are choosing not to disregard the material that they are working with in their work. That is to say that when they paint on a canvas, or when they paint on a surface, that surface is key to the work itself. And so for instance, I am currently preparing a show that's going to open in Johannesburg in February, where some of the artworks that are presented in that show are African artists who have chosen to paint on newspapers. And so I've taken and pasted newspapers up on a wooden, some wood basically, and then chosen to paint on top of that. And then in the past, the argument within art history has been, oh well, Africans are so poor and they don't have access to real canvases, so therefore they're painting on random materials. And I think that that argument is flawed because it takes away from the agency of these artists in choosing how they represent their work. And so 3 of the artists included in that exhibition are artists who have taken the time to pick up the newspapers in their local area, selected which dates and texts were really important to them, and then assembled that into the background and then painted on top of it. Which creates to me a level of relationship with the surface, with the materiality that is, you cannot separate the work from the materials that are being used in that case. And that is something that is an example of something I've been really interested in, and is a part of a larger understanding of African art right now. Probably one of the most famous African contemporary artists that I would encourage you guys to look into. His name is Ibrahim Mahama. He's from Ghana, and he uses repurposed textiles, objects, archives to recreate his works. And so, if you're familiar with jute sacks, which are these brown bags that we often transport cocoa in, he takes these jute sacks and creates fantastic sculptures out of those that he puts up on the wall and he covers buildings in, and he has become kind of synonymous with what African art, one of the themes that are sort of prevalent in African art, and materiality is the core of his practice, and I get to work with him as well, so that's very exciting. So that's one of the themes I'm interested in.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for the question. Any other questions from the audience before we close up? Cool. Then I think I'll just say thank you guys. Very much appreciated. Thank you for sharing the words. Where can the people contact you if they want to come and
Thank you so much. This is fun because as a curator, you're usually behind the scenes, and the artist is the one at the front, so I'm very grateful to have this opportunity. You can find me, my name is Max Diallo Jacobson, or in Swedish, Jakobsen, so you can just search that up. I have a website and email if you ever need any advice when it comes to art, if you're thinking yourself of acquiring art, or working on an exhibition or anything, I'm always open.
Thank you. Thank you.